was largely because I didn't really know my own continent. And I kind of assumed I did. And we dashed off to the North Pole, the South Pole, Hong Kong, Chile, wherever. I always came back, flew over Europe. I thought, oh yes, one day I'll do that. But although I knew France and knew Spain, I didn't know the eastern side of Europe at all. Largely because during my lifetime that had been behind the Iron Curtain. It had been very difficult to get there. And yet it is very close. Most of the destinations we went to were in certainly 3 hours flying time. And it suited me to do something different from Himalaya and Sahara, which didn't rely purely on extraordinary geography, but also were really more about people and culture, politics and history and all that sort of stuff that was quite close to me. So it was a voyage of discovery to Eastern Europe for me, because I hadn't been to many of these countries. The other thing was that it seems to be a very important time for Europe. What's happened since the 1990s is that a lot of countries have become independent, new countries have been created. There's a terrific mood of optimism and excitement and hope for these countries that at last they've discovered their own identity, their own language, their own currency, all that sort of thing. And yet they're going to be, via the European Union, part of a wider whole which is Europe. So there'll actually be sort of cooperation in Europe rather than conflict and conquest and all the things that have traditionally held the continent together. So it did seem a really interesting period. What's going to happen to Europe and with all these new countries? So that's why I decided to call it New Europe rather than Eastern Europe, because we also go to Turkey, we go to Ukraine. It's really more about the uniting of Europe and the countries I want to be part of. And also, as I say, seeing a lot of new places. We will have travelled through 20 countries, which is twice as many as Himalaya and Sahara put together. There's just an awful lot of countries out there now. Although the distances aren't enormous, the differences between these countries are quite considerable. Most of the countries I didn't know at all well. I had been through Eastern Europe in 1986. I'd been to Prague a couple of times. I'd been to Estonia, for instance, and Istanbul on pole to pole, on the other journeys, but only very briefly. And most of the countries were quite new to me. So I was interested to see how the ones I knew had changed and what the rest were like. And places like Estonia changed considerably, because when we went in there in 1990 on pole to pole, it was part of the Soviet Union, and the docks were just patrolled by a few soldiers, and they sort of glowered at anybody coming in. Now they've got an enormous sort of dock area, tourist facilities, people welcoming you, showing you around. There's bars and cafes everywhere. It's a very high-tech country now, Estonia. The whole sort of Wi-Fi, the whole area. You can use a computer anywhere and all that sort of stuff. It's really made a giant leap from being a Soviet republic without a great deal going for it to something now which is an independent country with only 1.5 million people, but extraordinarily sort of inventive and creative and lively too. So, there were changes. I did have an image which a lot of people of my generation probably shared, which is that Europe, the Soviet bloc, the eastern part of Europe, was largely monochrome. There was no colour there, it was just grey. It was huge, great sort of concrete blocks and barbed wire and soldiers and guard posts and all that sort of thing. The Berlin Wall, these were our images of Europe. And part of the reason I wanted to do this journey was to sort of correct this impression, because clearly there was colour. I mean, you don't suddenly switch on colour when the politics change. There must have been beautiful places as well. There must have been old cities, there must have been old towns, there must have been mountains, there must have been lakes. And so I wanted to sort of put some colour, for us to put some colour back into to Eastern Europe. And of course, we found out that it is full of beautiful places. There's countryside that's much less spoiled than it is in the West. Places like the Danube Delta. There's a wonderful sort of sandbar called the Curonian Spit, which goes down from Latvia into a place called Kaliningrad. Wonderful area for some wild birds, migrating birds and all that. The Carpathian Mountains, not many people know them very well. They're very, very beautiful mountain ranges. So we did discover that the rest of the continent is very beautiful. There was lots of colour. And in the cities as well, some were beautifully preserved, others have been restored after the war. I mean, the worst thing about Eastern Europe was that there was terrific damage in the war, both from Germans going in, Russians coming in to relieve the cities after the war, and the Allies, ourselves included, bombing a lot of these cities because, we wanted to get the Germans out, so they were really badly damaged. And yet, a lot of them were brilliantly restored. Someone like Gdansk, which was Danzig in Poland, or Warsaw in Poland as well. Beautifully restored, lovely cities. And so, yeah, I thought this looks great. It isn't monochrome at all. It isn't grey. It was like that at one time. It was a bit like the sort of welcome that you got when you used to go there, which was very sort of guarded, because they didn't really, want to have much connection with the outside world. Now they're so much more friendly, and I'm showing you where the local bookshop is, where there's a cafe, where there's a club, a real feeling that colour had come back into their lives, and they had more options and more chances, and their countries were every bit as beautiful as those of Western Europe. Part of the, for me, the sort of revelation of the journey was countries that I really hadn't heard of. Moldova, Kaliningrad, Transnistria, places like names that meant nothing to me. Now I know more about them. And Moldova, for instance, is a Russian republic in the north of the Black Sea, quite small. There's only about 5 million people, and yet in Moldova there are 2 breakaway republics. I mean, how tough is that? You've only got a small country that's split into 3 parts anyway. And part of the problem was in Moldova that some of it is Russian and some of it's Romanian, because it's like a lot of the countries on the edge of the Russian border, they're sort of torn both ways to either be part of the old Soviet bloc and they have affinities with Russia, and the others desperately want to become part of the European Union. And so in Moldova, you have Moldova itself, and then a small republic called Transnistria, across the Dniester River, literally, which was very Russian-oriented. And they'd had a war in the 1990s against Moldova, and had set up this breakaway republic, which nobody but themselves recognises. But we went there on their national day. They had their own march past and their own sort of festival and their own sort of celebrations. So I'd not heard of Moldova, and I'd not even heard of, obviously not heard of Transnistria, their breakaway republic. And in there's a part of Russia and Europe still left over from the war called Kaliningrad, which is the very northeastern part of Germany. And you come down from the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, you suddenly find yourself in this country in the middle of European countries, like European EU countries now, like Poland and the Baltics, and yet it's part of Russia. It's completely ringed by European Union countries. But again, we were there, able to film on their national day, and to see a tiny little country like that, which is a sort of province of Russia really, of about 2 or 3 million people, revelling in their own sort of customs and their own way of doing things. It's quite, it was really intriguing. And I say 20 countries in a fairly small, short distance that we covered was quite amazing. Places like Albania and Macedonia, which I knew almost nothing about, and now know a little bit more. I now short distance that we covered was quite amazing. Places like Albania and Macedonia, which I knew almost nothing about, and now know a little bit more. I now know there's lots to see there. I now know there's lots of interest in foreigners coming in and all that sort of stuff. I found there were quite ambivalent attitudes to the European Union. Those who were doing well, were making a bit of money, liked the idea of a European Union because it's freeing up jobs, it's freeing up money for projects and all that. And they see the European Union as being a very generous hand, financing businesses, enabling them to sort of make cars in their country to sell all over Europe, which they wouldn't have been able to do in the old days when Europe was split in two. Others lower down the scale, the earning scale. Certainly a lot of older people feel there was a kind of certainty, kind of quiet sort of protective confidence that they had in the old Soviet days. They may not have been allowed to travel, they may not have been allowed to make a profit, they may not have been allowed to, play the stock exchange, but they were reasonably comfortable, well protected within their own country. And for those people, I think there's a certain amount of fear that the European Union may just come in will come the businessmen, they will make the money, the people at the bottom will get ripped off. And there's a lot of evidence of that happening. The tough, clever businessmen are doing very well out of it. Unfortunately, also a lot of pretty dark and devious businesses like sex trafficking and drugs are also sort of coming in to fill the vacuum. It's the free market, some of it will be good, some of it will be bad. And I think that's something that's really going to have to be ironed out in the next few years. But I say, for the moment, the general feeling amongst most of the people we met, most of the sort of, I suppose you could say, more educated people, was that the European Union was a good thing. It would give them a chance to play on a bigger stage, and it would replace the oppression of the Soviet Union with the sort of liberal generosity of the rest of Europe. But others said, well, it's going to be tricky. And a very interesting quote which someone said was that it's like exchanging years of claustrophobia for years of agoraphobia. And in one way, they were all right. You couldn't move far, but you knew where you were. Now you can go anywhere you want, but the choice is almost too much for a lot of people. One feature of the journey in all the countries that East Europe went to was the drain of labour, and very often qualified labour, out of those countries to Western Europe. A lot of doctors, specialists, scientists, whatever, will be going over to get more opportunity and more work outside the country, because previously they weren't allowed to travel. Now they can. Hopefully they will bring back money and they'll bring those skills back to the country. But the brain drain and the labour drain is quite a major problem.